Half a day. Oh, timegay pogo. Not many people today. Oh, good. Good, Malik. It's just the cool people. Uy. Safa jamu tsumoguyano. Safa jamu pumegay patasmo. Yapagaho. Mientras mamananagwidzo. Sorry, my daughter likes to put her feet on my back while I'm teaching. Ew, kalakas este. Ooh, esta ni isang papag of kalakas este. All right. Well, all right. So today we're making the transition into the periods that are a little bit closer to our lives. So today we're learning about a figure who sort of goes from the Spanish period into the American period and helps in interesting ways with that transition. And so today we're learning about our fourth figure in this series. See, oh wait, are you recording? Travis, are you going to record?
It's recording.
Okay, Malik, just making sure. All right, number 4 in our list of 10, Påle Jose Torres Palomo. And so Påle Jose Torres Palomo, or Påle Palomo, Padre Palomo, is the first ever CHamoru to become a Catholic priest. And it's interesting thinking about sort of his history and what he represents in a lot of different ways. He is somebody who was very important in Guam's history, but he's also somebody who in a lot of ways is largely forgotten. As we will learn at the end of the class, one of the main things that he has to his name today is that he has a park, which is tucked away in the village of Hagatnya. And many people don't even know that that park exists because of sort of where it fits in sort of the hustle and bustle of traffic along Marine Drive. But he was incredibly consequential and incredibly important in his life. And we're going to touch on some of those things in this presentation, in this lecture. So one of the things that Påle Palomo was born into a very mestizo family. The Palomo Torreses, these were all sort of high-class Chamorro families back in the day. And one of the things that, he's born in 1836, but one of the things that his family is tragically connected to is the smallpox epidemic that hits the island in the 1850s. And so part of the reason that this is connected to his family is because Jose Palomo, so 2 men from Guam, a Tudela and a Palomo, were on an American ship in the Philippines, and they were traveling back to Guam. While they were at sea, somebody had died of smallpox, and they had dumped the body overboard. Now, when they arrived in Guam, they were supposed to observe strict quarantine. But instead of that, the 2 men from Guam were let off the ship early, and the American ship left early without sort of following strict quarantine procedures. No one seemed sick. Everything seemed okay. But within a couple months, the smallpox epidemic had started on the island. And at first, it hit the village of Hagatnya hardest, that the Spanish actually blockaded the village, trying to keep it in Hagatnya, in the main city, in the main village, the capital of the island. So for a time, nobody was allowed to enter or leave Hagatnya. But this didn't stop the spread. And soon it extended to every corner of the island. And for the Spanish and for Filipinos who already had built up immunities to smallpox, it didn't hit them as bad. But for Chamorros, who diseases still continued to ravage their community, every time a new ship came in, it could potentially bring a new disease in, and it could potentially kill dozens, hundreds, And in this case, it killed thousands. And so Spanish priests and Filipino assistants and government workers continue to try to sort of help the community as best they could. But in time, it overwhelmed even their ability. There was no way to stop it. There was no way to protect from it. And it got so bad that sometimes families where somebody had died, the body would be, from smallpox, the body might be placed in front of the house for somebody from the government to collect it, and that body might wait there for days or for weeks. And that you might even find some houses where everybody in the family had died from the smallpox epidemic. And so the village of Palgo, which is where Palgo Bay is, was hit the hardest by the smallpox epidemic, even to the point where it was abandoned as a village. Palgo had been named one of the 6 villages that the Spanish allowed to continue to exist after they had sort of dominated the Chamorro people after the wars. But at this time, because of the huge death there, the people in the village abandoned it. And so that's why there wasn't anything there for quite a long time. Just a lot of very strong tautomona that are in some ways attached to that story. So Padre Palomo, whose father was one of the carriers that sort of brought smallpox to the island, he died early on. And Padre Palomo, who wasn't a priest just yet, he saw sort of the heroism of the priests, the sacrifices they took in trying to help the people, comfort them, going around the island. And he did his best to also help wherever he could. And so this is often cited as one of the things that inspired him to become a priest. Now, it wasn't surprising that he take this route. So, before I forget, more than half of the Chamorro population died from this smallpox epidemic. And so at the beginning of this pandemic, I wrote a series of articles for my column in the Pacific Daily News, in which I talked about Guam's history of pandemics and how the ability to close an island off and the ability of an island to protect itself from these sorts of things has been essential. But oftentimes, and Padre Palomo himself was critical of the Spanish government for not following their own procedures and bringing unnecessary danger and tragedy to the island when the smallpox epidemic hit. But Padre Palomo was part of the privileged class of mestizo Chamorros or Chamorros. This class was started after the Chamorro-Spanish Wars with those who were loyal and had helped the Spanish defeat the rebel Chamorros. And so these were the ones that got access to the education on the island, which was very limited. But the education on the island was started with the intent not to prepare Chamorros for sort of fancy job opportunities or prepare them to leave the island and seek sort of greater fortunes. The purpose of education, especially for young boys, was to prepare them to be priests' assistants or to help priests to work in the church. And so one of the fascinating things, and I was talking about it in my teach-in last night, focusing on decolonizing education, is that a lot of Spanish governors didn't like the education that was there on Guam because it made Chamorros feel like that their island should have more than what the Spanish was giving them. So for example, by these boys who would go to, let's say, a boarding school in Hagatna and learn not just about the church, but also learn about philosophy, learn about history, they would be exposed Philippines. They have an economy and they have businesses, and why is it that we aren't allowed these? How come we don't get these things on Guam? And so different Spanish governors actually tried to close down these schools or argued against them, or that the money be used elsewhere, because they felt like it made Chamorros ask too many questions, and it made them so that they weren't comfortable with the sort of the lazy, docile life that the Spanish Empire had planned for them. So Padre Palomo went through that system, and he showed himself to be a great student, an intelligent, bright young man. who was very interested in sort of continuing his education, and his family had the means. And so with the work of local priests, he was able to go to the seminary, San Juan Carlos Seminary in the Philippines. And so after attending there, he was eventually initiated as a formal Catholic priest, the first ever for the Chamorro people. He served in different places in Micronesia as a priest, and he served in different villages on Guam, but he was most known for being a priest in Hagatna. This is the earliest known photograph of Padre Palomo. This is taken when he was in his early 50s, I think by a German explorer who was passing through Micronesia. And so he was the first, and he was the only Chamorro priest for a very long time. So this is something that's interesting to consider, is that by this time, Chamorros are very Catholic. They've accepted Catholicism as part of their lives, but the government, the church and the government necessarily didn't treat them with a great deal of respect. There was still a lot of colonial ideas about Chamorros as not wanting more in life, as being free from ambition, as being just dirty and simple people. And so there weren't really efforts to push them to be anything more. And so that's why, even though there was lots of Chamorros who believed strongly in the Catholic Church, the church wasn't preparing young men to actually sort of be part of the church necessarily. And so he was the only Chamorro voice for a very long time. And one of the interesting things about him is that even though he was mestizo, so he had Spanish heritage, he worked with Spanish priests, and he also was critical of them, because he strongly believed that in some ways they were hypocrites, in some ways they were holding the people back. And so while he was faithful to the church, he wasn't necessarily blindly loyal to the Spanish Empire. And so he believed that a lot of these priests didn't do the best that they could for the people. And when the United States came in 1898, this was a key moment for Padre Palomo. The United States, when sort of Henry Glass brought his ships around Guam, and one of them into Apra Harbor, sort of in bringing Guam into the Spanish-American War. This was a huge change. And Padre Palomo, in some ways, things that he had been feeling, things that he had thought about, things that he had wished were different, he hoped strongly that a change in the colonial guard might make a big difference. And so one thing to note, though, is that when America first came to Guam, we have to remember, and we cannot put our own perceptions today back into the past, right? So nowadays, we feel this strong connection to the United States. We may be a territory of the United States. We have experienced and continue to experience discrimination, displacement, stuff like that. But we feel connected to the United States in a number of ways. Chamorros at this time tended to have a very bad impression of the United States. They didn't like Americans. And they didn't like Americans for different reasons, depending on your social class. But one of the main reasons was because of the term badzinero, which is a term for whaler. So most of what Chamorros at this time knew about the United States came from whalers who stopped in Guam. And whalers across the Pacific had terrible reputations, because these were men that would, sit hunkered and packed into ships for months at a time, crisscrossing the Pacific looking for whales. And then when they would finally come ashore, they would often wreak havoc. They would steal, they would rape, they would get into fights. And so they brought this to Guam too. And so when Chamorros, and so it even got so bad at one point that a group of whalers even overthrew the Spanish governor for a night, because they got drunk and they overpowered the guards in this governor's palace, and then they overthrew the government and then quickly got on a ship and left. And so the boarding house that whalers stayed in had windows and had doors that locked inside, because they could not be let free to roam around the island. And so this is an image from Lawrence Cunningham's book, A History of Guam, you know, in which one of the things that Chamorros loved to do, because they did not like whalers, was that there was like a taxi service in the 1800s from Pidi, where the ships would come in, to Hagatna. And so what they would do is that they would have a fleet of cows with like a leather strap, and they would put the whalers on the cows. And then once all the whalers were on the cows, and they had to pay like 50 cents to sort of get the cow ride from Pidi to Hagatna. Once they were on the cows, Chamorros loved to sort of like freak them out and try to get them to fall off the cows by making the cows run really fast. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to ride a cow. I have never ridden a cow before, but I imagine it might be more difficult than trying to ride a horse or a cow or bow. And so when the Americans first came into Guam in 1898, Chamorros were afraid. Most of them were afraid. The stories say that actually some families fled Hagatna to go into the jungle, worried about what the Americans might do given the behavior that they'd seen from the whalers in the past. But in fact, when they disarmed the Chamorro militia, when the US forces disarmed the Chamorro militia, one of the soldiers faints because he's so afraid, because everything they've seen of the Americans doesn't bode well for them. But it was largely a bloodless takeover. But it began a period of over a year, which was crazy and complicated and is almost completely lost in history books today. So the period from 1898 to 1899, after the US takes Guam, but before it formally sets up a government on Guam, is really interesting. And I'm only going to talk briefly about parts of it in this presentation, but I have a much longer lecture which gets into that period because it's really fascinating, and it really it portends a lot of things that come later on in terms of mistreatment by the United States, but it also shows that any idea that Chamorros in the past didn't care about their government or weren't critical is simply not true. So when the Americans come in 1898, they set up a flag in Apra, formally taking the island. But when Henry Glass, who is on his way to the Philippines to defeat the Spanish in Manila, when he leaves, he takes the flag with him. He doesn't even leave it on the island of Guam. They take the Spanish governor, they take the Spanish officials, but they leave behind Filipinos who worked for the Spanish in the government. And so what happens almost immediately after Glass leaves is that there's a power struggle. Two figures emerge as being sort of the two dominant forces. And part of what's weird about this history is that there's different accounts. Sometimes they conflict, sometimes they contradict. And there's one main account given by a man named Frank Portasac that is often sort of cited, but Frank Portasac loved to sort of promote himself and market himself. And so the two figures that emerge, one of them is Jose Sisto, who was the treasurer of the Spanish government in Guam. He becomes the highest ranking Spanish official left on the island. And so he puts out to the people that he is now in charge of the island because the Americans didn't even formally take the island. By the rules of capture, you have to leave a force behind, and you got to at least leave your flag. You have to leave a government behind. You have to leave an occupying force behind if your claim is to be recognized by other nations. So Sisto asserts that he is still in charge of the island and that Spanish sovereignty still reigns. Frank Portasac is an interesting figure. They say he's Portuguese, he's Spanish, but he's a naturalized American citizen at the same time. And he says that Henry Glass, the captain who took Guam, Henry Glass asked him to take care of the island until America figures out what to do with it. And so over the next year, these two forces go back and forth. Sometimes it goes to all-out fighting between the two gangs of forces that they represent. Most notably, fighting breaks out around Christmas in 1898 when at a cockfight in the village of Sumai, between when Jose Sisto is paying the police, he's paying the military, because the Americans didn't even take the Spanish treasury or the Spanish armory when they left. And so he controls those forces, but Frank Portasac has a gang of his friends who are trying to keep the peace as well. And so they clash at a cockfight towards the end of 1898. And so it's a crazy time where at one point at the end of 1898, Jose Sisto and his forces plan to re-raise the Spanish flag in Hagatna. His followers claim that they are going to meet them at dawn with guns to fight to keep the island under the Americans. And the standoff doesn't happen because an American ship arrives before the standoff can happen. And so what comes from this, though, actually, is that in this power vacuum, because different American captains come through on their way to the Philippines, and they don't know what to do. The Chamorros ask them, are you going to set up a government? Are the Spanish still in charge? And these American captains, they're lower level guys. They're just trying to run their ship. They don't know. And so eventually, what happens is that there's a man who's half Samoan, half English, a man named William Coe, where he is put in charge of the island after a Chamorro named Joaquin Perez was put in charge of the island temporarily. And so that's why if you ever want to win super trivia games, if they ask you who's the first modern Chamorro governor of Guam, Joaquin Perez is an answer that you can say, even though it was technically unofficial. But so William Coe encourages Chamorros to form a government in the interim, formally. So there was sort of a cabal of people who would meet regularly to try to talk about the business of the island and help people. But eventually Coe says that you need to create a government, because what happens is when the Europeans came to Samoa, because we already had a tribal chiefly government, they signed a treaty with us. If you don't have a government here when the Americans come back, then they're not going to sign a treaty with you. They're going to tell you what you are. So in July of 1899, and we have very few records about this, in Hagatna, a group of leaders are elected into, I guess, the first true Guam Congress. And so these are people that are meant to represent the island, and that when the Americans come and formally take the island back, they will be able to talk to them and help them in transition. But the Navy officers that are in the island disagree with this and disband it. And Chamorros, unfortunately, listen to that and do not sort of keep their nerve in terms of this new government that they have created. But a key figure in all of this, a key ally with Frank Portasac, was Padre Palomo. Now, Padre Palomo knew more about the world than most Chamorros because he was very literate. He could speak multiple languages. He's definitely a polyglot. He had been to Manila. He had been around Micronesia. When people came through, visiting from Guam from other places, he was often somebody that you wanted to meet, to talk to. And so he was familiar with more than just Guam in terms of the possibilities for existence and even for governance. And so Jose Palomo became somebody who tried to help Chamorros understand that there could be something different and better under the United States. That under the Spanish, one of the things that Palomo didn't like is that the Spanish had really kept Guam stagnant economically, that they hadn't, and that they hadn't advanced Chamorros politically either. And so he told Chamorros stories about how in the United States, you know, people elect their leaders. People elect their leaders. And that in the United States, everybody has basic rights and freedoms. And that there's these possibilities. And if the United States comes in, they can bring those to Guam. And as a priest, and as the only Chamorro priest, his voice was pretty effective in calming fears that people had about the United States as being a crazy country filled with ravaging whalers. And so when in 1899, the United States formally set up a government in Guam, with Richard Leary being the first Navy governor of Guam, formal Navy governor of Guam, Jose Palomo was very, very important in terms of helping the new Navy government connect to the people. And in truth, the new Navy government didn't necessarily want to connect with the people. The ideas that the Navy had about Chamorros at that time were very medieval. They believed, for example, according to one Navy doctor, that every single Chamorro had a terrible disease that could kill a white man. They believed that the island of Guam was filthy and that the Chamorro people were filthy. And so, and in fact, when the US Navy first comes in, it's common for most of the sailors, because they're all white, to refer to Chamorros as the N-word. Not knowing what Chamorros were, not caring what they were, they go around calling Chamorros the N-word. And eventually it reaches such a point that the Navy governor has to put out an order saying that Chamorros are not Negroes. But William Safford was different. William Safford was the lieutenant governor under Richard Leary, and he spoke Spanish, and he which had Hispanic elements, but also Pacific Islander elements to it too. And so he rented a house from a Torres who worked for the government at that time. And that's the house that he stayed in Hagåtña. And he became a very close friend with Padre Palomo and other Chamorro leaders at that time. And in fact, even for years after he left, because the Navy unfortunately didn't like how close he became to Chamorros. And even though he could have been of vital use to them, a lot of the Navy didn't like the fact that he was treating with respect. He continued to write letters and have correspondence with Chamorros, including Padre Palomo, up until his death. He also wrote with Agatha Johnston, who we may talk about later on this list. And so William Safford, when he was on Guam, he tried to help build bridges between the United States, sort of the indifference and the racism of the Navy and the community, trying to sort of, and so one of the things that he did is that he learned to speak Chamorro, and he wrote a number of books, including a Chamorro language book, which it has a lot of errors in it, but but it was a very interesting try. He also wrote a book which talked about the plants of Guam, and he did write an account of his year on Guam as well. And you can read all these things. Gillette Leon Guerrero and her publishing company, Guamology, republished his books, republished some of his accounts, his Plants of Guam book in a very nice version with illustrations by Judy Flores. And so, and in fact, if you remind me, I'll go get my copy and I can show it to you. But so this is one of the main ways that Padre Palomo continued to operate as that bridge to the United States. But one of the problems that emerged very, very quickly was that the United States, for whatever Padre Palomo believed about the ideals of the United States, they did not make it to Guam, not at this time. And so this is on the image on the left is from the Guam newsletter, which was the first newspaper published on Guam. This is from, I believe, 1911. And so it has sort of, it can give you an idea of the sense through which Uncle Sam and the Navy treated the Chamorros. So note, Uncle Sam is on the left, tall, he stands above advancement. On the right is sort of the brown sort of androgynous Chamorro of Guam, represents the island. And so the thing though here is that they try to say that the island of Guam is growing, but the island of Guam doesn't grow on its own. It only grows because of the things that the US has given to it. The paternalistic sort of rhetoric. But so all of the ideas that Jose Palomo talked about, especially the political ideas, weren't allowed to exist in Guam. So Chamorros weren't allowed to elect their own leaders. They weren't actually given rights by the United States. In fact, they were withheld rights, even basic rights, because when the US came in and the flag flew over Guam, the US didn't allow the Constitution to extend to Guam. Instead, Guam became a military base. And so the naval governor had supreme authority over the island. And so what Chamorros experienced over the next 40 years is that some Navy governors didn't care. Some Navy governors tried to help the people, and that some Navy governors were total jerks. And that as the commander on this base, it didn't matter if you weren't in the military, his power extended to the whole island. And so some Chamorros experienced, for example, if the Navy governor was just irritated at you, he could fine you. If he didn't like you, he felt you had disrespected him, he could throw you in jail for any reason. And there was no recourse to do anything because, as some Chamorros tried, if you tried to take it to the court system on the island, the judges on the court were under the Navy governor, and they worked for the Navy governor, and they had to obey whatever order the Navy governor gave. And so this is why, so despite sort of the rhetoric at that time, it didn't extend to Guam, not for a long time. Some of the economic freedoms did extend. So the US Navy did, it did do more to sort of promote certain things. The US Navy brought more money into the island than the Spanish government had during its time. And so Chamorros were able to benefit off of this. But there was a huge gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And this is why one of the things to remember, I always want to fight back and push back against the idea that in the past our ancestors had less to say, or that in the past our ancestors thought less about the world. We want to get rid of that idea. We don't want to about their families and didn't think about much else. Because if you think about that, you in a sense are giving new life to what the colonizers said about the Chamorro people, that they didn't really care. As long as they could go to church, as long as they could farm, and as long as they could cheat on their spouse, they were good. As long as they had their tsakma, their gumadzuus, you know, and their ahu and their kadu, they were good. But that's simply not true. Communities, people always have questions about their existence, but sometimes cultures try to defer, try to reject and suppress those questions. Sometimes the governments and the systems of life around it try to do it. But as we talked about last class, those questions were always there. And so even Padre Palomo, who strongly believed that America coming to Guam was going to benefit the Chamorro people, even he was not sort of afraid to criticize the United States. And so if there's ever any ideas that it's sort of a happy honeymoon, the moment America comes to Guam, that's simply not true. In fact, Padre Palomo himself and Chamorros themselves were very frustrated at the beginning with the United States, because you hear about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, but one of the first things that the Navy started to do when they first came in although later it was relaxed, was they started to interfere with religious rituals, banning the ringing of church bells because it would wake up sailors at bad times and interfere with their training, trying to ban religious processions because they found it to be a waste and they found it interfered with public life. And so in 1901, Padre Palomo joins about 30, 31, 32 other men, most of whom are Chamorro, one of whom is an American, one or two of whom are American, and a number are Filipino. And some of them are Filipinos who were political prisoners deported from the Philippines. But they sign a petition sent to the US Congress in which they call out the United States for its hypocrisy in Guam. Two of the passages which are most important for this: a military government at best is distasteful and highly repugnant to the fundamental principles of civilized government, and peculiarly so to those on which is based the American government. Ouch, that's a deep cut. Because that's exactly what the United States had created in Guam. The American flag was flying over the island, but a military government is what they had given the Chamorro people and the island. And America prides itself on a number of things, but military control or the separation from the military and civilian controls is one of the most important things that the United States has formalized. Which is why, if you're familiar with the history of the United States, breaking that apart is one reason why the United States hasn't had coups, hasn't had military overthrows, because there's a distinction and a separation. It is not an exaggeration to say that fewer permanent guarantees of liberty and prosperity rights exist now than when under Spanish domain. The governor of the island exercises supreme power in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, with absolutely no limitations to his actions. The people of this island having no voice whatsoever in the formulation of any law of the naming of a single official. And so you can see that for these men, they were very aware of the hypocrisy and the contradictions in the American arrival in Guam. They knew what was good about American government, and they recognized that it didn't exist in Guam. Chamorros were Spanish citizens, and it is true that they did actually have more rights under Spain. And so when the Americans came in, they found that a military commander would have total control over their lives. They were worried and they were confused because, at least at the end of the Spanish period, Chamorros were allowed to elect their own mayors. But under the Americans, you weren't allowed to do that now. And so this petition, though, was the first of many that Chamorro sent over the next 40 years. These petitions were largely ignored. A few of them were heard by members of Congress, some of whom tried to help the Chamorro people, but overall, these petitions were pretty much ignored. And so Padre Palomo, soon after the Americans came in, he began to become ill. And so he couldn't be as active as he used to, but he still said Mass. He still, for a few more years, said sermons. But in time, he slowly, he became sort of less and less active. In 1919, while he was performing Mass in Hagåtña, he collapsed. And so Padre Roman de Vera, who was a Basque priest, who sort of had a strong love for the Chamorro language and culture in some ways, he said the last rites to Påle Palomo while he was on the floor of the cathedral. And so, looking ahead into sort of today, the importance of Padre Palomo, and in fact, they named a school after him, sort of recognizing that he was essential in helping them connect in some ways to the community and helping the community be more open to this new regime. Today, there is very little for the legacy of Padre Palomo. There is this park in Hagåtña, which is stuck between a building which is like a headquarters for taxis, and then the American military and German cemetery on the right. And so this is one of the unfortunate things about GUAM history, and one reason why I do these types of classes, is that here was somebody who saw so many changes and who was so important and provides a critical model in some ways for Chamorros in terms of negotiating their colonizers, speaking up about the situation, the conditions of their existence. But when we look at our own history and how we teach and remember history on our island, we see that sort of a lot of those figures that we could prop up, like Padre Palomo and others, they get replaced with figures usually from the United States. And so it's unfortunate. Padre Palomo, and there's a lot more that I could have talked about sort of in this presentation too. If you are somebody who believes strongly in the Catholic faith, Padre Palomo was one of those who tried to help keep Chamorros faithful to Catholicism, even when the United States started to allow new religions to come into Guam. He was somebody who was essential because the keeping the community close, but then also making a transition. Because what we saw in the 20th century, early 20th century, was that the church went from being a place which housed privilege and enabled community privilege. So the church before promoted a lot of Spanish language, Latin. It was really about showcasing the outside as being better, and Chamorros kind of have to live up to that. But in the early 20th century, we see a shift where the church, in order to try to maintain its connection to the community, starts to localize itself more and more. And part of that is Padre Palomo and then Roman de Vera later, where they start to translate more songs into Chamorro, where they start to say more masses in Chamorro, where the connection to the culture is brought out more to hopefully prevent Chamorros from trying to seek spiritual connections in the new religions, the Protestant religion, which has come into the island. And that shift is effective for the most part. Protestantism never grows beyond about 500 or 600 people on the island, and that the overwhelming majority still remain with the Catholic Church. But why did I pick Padre Palomo? He was somebody who saw a lot, was there for a lot. But he was also somebody that we should remember that when we look to our past, we always want to portray our ancestors as thinking about the world. If we look to our past and we can see that our ancestors were thinking, were negotiating and navigating, it gives us more strength today to also do that. But if we think of our ancestors as people who just went with the flow of history, that as colonizers changed flags, they just flowed with history, which is what many Chamorros do, many Chamorros feel, some of our own history books say it. If we do that, then we end up making it more natural for us not to think today as well, because we can assume that Chamorros just kind of go with the flow. That's their place in our own history, is that as the flags change, we change. And so, hey, I finished. Woohoo! I was trying to keep it under 50 minutes. And that was like, yeah, because we started a little bit late. Viva. All right, who has questions? Does anyone have any questions? It can be about this, it can be about the last lecture.
I want to see the plant book.
Okay, hold on, I'm going to wrap them. So useful plants of Guam, and this is the one that Gillette created. She republished because it's in the public domain, and so you can also get original versions of it too. Sometimes I got an original copy of it too. Found it on Amazon when somebody was selling it once. But you could probably still find it online. But so in the back it has photographs and pictures too. So, and plates, sort of like photo plates of different plants on Guam. And so it's a pretty cool book. Ooh, look, that's neti. This is a picture of swordgrass. If you remember swordgrass from Guam, ooh, swordgrass sucks.
Yeah, it's painful.
Yeah, swordgrass is one of those delayed pain mechanisms because you're walking through it, and you're feeling, man, swordgrass, this isn't so bad. I'm strong. I'm Magalahi strong. And then once you're done and out of the swordgrass, and if you put like water on it, it's like, oh,
It's like
I'm
a thousand paper cuts.
I'm a tiny little baby. Oh, please. Ay, nana Zeus, por favor. And so, yes.
Where are you gathering all the different information about Padre Palomo? Is it similar to the other class where there are Spanish and/or church documents that people would have to uncover, and is it also the same problem where it's the view of the church, or is this, or did he have journals and like that could be a source?
So one of the things, I don't know if he has journals, that'd be pretty cool. So one of the things that for Padre Palomo, he appears in a lot of different places because he was such an important figure. So in like Spanish accounts, they mention him because he was such an important part of the community. When people visit Guam, they would often meet with him because he was such an important part. Because if you were sailing across the Pacific and you stopped in Guam, you would want to meet the learned people of Guam, and so he was often the one that you would meet with. But he's also but yeah, because he's so. And then later, the Americans write a lot about him because he's so important to them. And in fact, one thing that happens is that the Spanish priests who he worked with, eventually once the Americans come in, he starts to reveal to them what he feels about them. And so they feel that he betrayed the Spanish, but he was simply looking out for his people, because he, even if some of them may have been his friends, he felt the Americans called the Spanish moral lepers, and Padre Palomo agreed with that many of them were moral lepers. But so there's lots of places that you can see. I mean, even in just so every Guam history book will have a section on Padre Palomo. Some of it you can get, some stuff is even in oral history within his family too. Some stories, but yeah, there's not. You can even find some of his letters. Hold on. I had a picture of one of his letters.
I have a question regarding
Yes,
whalers. You mentioned, or maybe I misunderstood, are they Americans, the whalers?
The whalers were largely Americans at that time. There was other countries that had whaling ships too, but that was like but Americans were the big whaling sort of contingent in the second half of the 1800s. And so most all of them came from New England.
Oh,
What's that?
I have an ancestor who was a whaler. I have an ancestor who was a whaler. That's sixth generation Scottish.
Oh, yeah. And so
John
one
Anderson.
one of the reasons why another reason why the community didn't like whalers is because that young Chamorro men would sometimes sign up with the ships and leave the island. And it was very rare for them ever to come back, which is why one Spanish governor wrote that by the 1880s, there was already 800 Chamorros living in Hawaii, primarily from men who had left as whalers and settled in Hawaii. Because in Hawaii, there was much more freedom, much more opportunity. And, you know, it was always hard to get back to Guam, harder to get back to Guam in those days. Some whalers, a few whalers did make their way back, though. The most famous were the Custino brothers, who brought Protestantism with them from Hawaii when they returned after the Americans came in. Okay, wait, hold on. So here is, for example, this is a letter from Påle Palomo to William Safford from 1902. And so his family has some of those. I've seen a couple of them, I remember. But yeah, so there's quite a bit. We're already so embedded in sort of, and in my teach-in last night when we were talking about education, there's just sort of this gravity in which, why would you want to create something for yourself when you can just Wikipedia whatever America's done or whatever America is? And so there's just this gravity that pulls us in that way. So rather than sort of using somebody like Padre Palomo as a historical example, instead you're just going to kind of talk about Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or something like that. And so that's what I always want to push back against, because you absolutely teach children lessons by not teaching them things. And so the most important lessons that you get in school is all of the things that you aren't taught, and especially if they're right around you. So that's why even up until now on Guam, we still deal with instructional absence, where you go for years in education and you're not taught about anything outside of your classroom or on your island. And what is the impact of that? It would have a very profound impact, because you would learn that your island doesn't matter. You would learn that sort of Chamorro stuff doesn't matter. You would learn that people on Guam don't matter. Even if no one said it to you directly, just by you spending 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in an air-conditioned classroom learning about everywhere else in the world, you would learn the absence, and therefore you would assign unconscious value to that it must not matter because it's not here. It's not here. And so, oh wait, hold on. What was the... And so, yeah, some of the petitions are there. Yes, some of them are in the congressional record. Some of them were sent to the Navy Department, the War Department, as it used to be called. Some of them were sent to presidents. And the petitions change in their character over time. So eventually, what the big thing that the petitions ask for later on is citizenship. Because at first, the first sort of generation of leaders under the American flag, they just want like local civilian government that they're connected to. But eventually, Chamorro leaders think that maybe if they're loyal and maybe if they ask for citizenship, that's what's going to make the difference. And so that's how they start to frame their pleas. As the late Carlos Taitano put it, the mindset was, how can you ask for something if you are outside of the family? Only once you're a member of the family, then can you expect to be treated with respect. And so that's why he and others pushed for citizenship, thinking that if Chamorros are finally formally brought into the United States, then America will treat them better. And they found that that's true in some ways and not true in other ways. But and so yes, you can see a lot of those. Some were signed by thousands. And then we may learn a little bit later about how Chamorros eventually, because of those petitions and them being ignored, finally decided to send two representatives to Washington, D.C. to lobby directly.
I noticed in the letter, it was 1902. It looked like a pretty good English.
Oh yeah. Padre Palomo spoke English.
Wow.
And so, and then he already spoke English before William Safford, but some accounts say that William Safford taught him English, but he already spoke English before that. But that's one thing that William Safford did, is that the Chamorro families that were sort of like higher class and wanted the Americans to improve Guam, they would ask him to teach them and their kids Chamorro English. Okay, does anyone, what are the Badzogu? Has anyone burned you with a Badzogu before? No? You never have? That's the seed where you rub it on something, you make it real hot, and then you put it on somebody. And then it burns them.
Now I remember.
Okay, yeah, you're tau
I
in a
don't
law
remember the
how.
name.
Again. And so I do not understand the meaning behind that saying, actually. I've heard that saying. Eloy Hara, who's on the Committee for Statehood for Guam, he always tells me that. Every time I fangingi him, because he's a war survivor, he's much older than me, he always then says, "Just as lahir za un dia siempre be tifi ao Badzogu." And then he says, "Yes, one day I'm going to pick a Badzogu for you." And I am always like, and then one day I asked him to explain what it meant to me, and he gave me a long explanation which didn't explain what it means. It was a very long, explanation about where it comes from. Oh, no. They come from anywhere, but it's one of those things where if you live more of a lancero, like a rancher sort of life, right? Because after the war, if you were, if you lived a little bit more urban life, then maybe you might play like board games or something like that, or you might have like a radio to listen to or a TV. But for kids on the ranch, you burn each other with Badzogu seeds, and then you what's it called? You gamble, you gamble with pieces of corn and stuff while you're playing Batu. So it's in fact, I want to ask Eloy Hara again. Maybe he'll give me a different explanation if I ask him again. But so now, if I had to guess, if I had to guess, I think it's just fun. I think it's just fun to say, because a lot of Chamorro sayings don't necessarily have a deep meaning. It's just that they sound nice, right? So some of you who have taken my language classes before, you have stuff like antes guantes. Antes guantes means before gloves. And it does not mean that, man, way back before we wore gloves, like pre-pandemic or something like that. It doesn't mean that at all. It's just that it sounds really fun to say antes guantes. And so rhyming, Charles love
Piti Piti, and we couldn't figure out like where it comes from or what does it really mean other than talkative.
Yeah, pizzi pizzi. I mean, it's perfect for when you think somebody who's talking a lot. Hey, pizzi pizzi pizzi, pizzi 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 pizzi. It makes sense. It makes sense.
Birds sound like.
Yeah, perfect. That totally makes sense. But that's a good one. Are there any other questions? And so I think I chose Påle Palomo because there's interesting sort of parallels. I mean, even just in terms of at the beginning, talking about the pandemic. And that one thing that, and it was something which made Palomo critical of the Spanish government, that the Spanish government wasn't necessarily taking care of the interests of the people, because if it cared about that, then it wouldn't be focused, it would be focused then on quarantining effectively so that the people would be safe. And so, yeah, I find him to be very fascinating in the sense that he was somebody who was trained under the Spanish, trained under Spanish priests, worked with Spanish priests, but he still kept a healthy criticism, skepticism, and critical eye about the Spanish Empire and about the Spanish influence in Guam. And so that's one thing to remember as we sort of, is that you don't want to only go into your history and find all of the people who resisted until their last breath, because it's really hard to find people like that, because history is filled with a spectrum of possibilities for how people see resisting, how people navigate, how people negotiate. And so sometimes people want to only look for those heroes who fought Spanish oppression, and we should definitely honor those heroes, but you have to look for those who negotiated, for those who sort of had critiques, because for me, I want our history not to be only sort of the nationalist resistance version, because if you do that, you don't give yourself a true history either. If you give yourself only the colonizer's history, the Quepua, Ignacio Jinete, Antonio Ayihi version, that's not true history. But if you also only give the Matapang, Aguil, and Harao history, that's not really true history either yet. Because yeah, life rarely sets it up so that you have a simple or stark choice like that. And so I bring that up because one of the reasons that I am somewhat critical of his argument, but it does have some truth to it too, is that Robert Underwood has talked about leapfrogging through history. That sort of people that are getting into their history and finding their roots today tend to leapfrog through history, looking for only, so basically you have hundreds of years of Chamorro history, and you have Angel Santos and then Matapang. And then you leap over hundreds of years of history because the Chamorros there aren't radical enough. The Chamorros there don't resist enough. The Chamorros there didn't fight back. And of course, we want to always look for those heroes, those people that were strong in the face of adversity. But we also have to remember that Chamorros thought of strength not simply in the one who fights back and who is able to kill the other. Chamorro saw strength in intelligence, in being witty and smart, articulate, able to navigate, able to outthink somebody. And so, so that's why for somebody like Padre Palomo, I do find that fascinating that he was so tied to Spanish privilege in the island. But instead, because he was influenced, oh, and I forgot to mention that. I had a slide in there. By talking to, he was also somebody who interacted with Filipino revolutionaries and Spanish political prisoners. And so that also sort of informed his view, because as the Philippines was moving towards revolution, what was to say that Chamorros shouldn't also have more rights in their own land? And so even though Palomo believed that better things would be under the United States, it didn't mean that he believed that Chamorros should be subsumed under the United States, that they should just sort of like disappear within the United States. But he would have been part of that generation who would have had a strong identity in a nationalist, or sort of in an emerging nationalist sense. And that's why he was part of the crew that when the Americans hadn't formally decided what they were going to do with Guam, he felt that Chamorros should start their own government. He was part of that crew. And so, yeah, I like how complicated and interesting sort of his life is. all of these different things that he participated in. All right. Are there any final sort of questions? If not, then next week we will be at the halfway point. Biba, I'm excited. And I think next week it'll be a woman because we've had 3 dudes in a row. And so I apologized at the very beginning though, that sometimes you have female figures, but there's not enough documented. And so, but I'm going to make sure that the next one is a female figure, so that we don't have too much of a lalahi party, guput lalahi. Or what is it that they say in English? Guput surisus, sausage party, guput surisus. All right, if that's it, si Diyos masi nutodos hamzo, nafansafu hamzo, put for bot. If you haven't voted, don't forget to vote. But stay safe when you're voting. Adios, estaque I manatli hitalo, until we see each other again next week.